Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome once again in this rather wet and miserable evening, in this rather wet and miserable time to In Conversation, brought to you by the Royal Society of Medicine. Now, I'm absolutely delighted today to say that our guest for this evening is Dame Claire Marks, one of the most honoured and distinguished doctors in the country, most famous, of course, for being an honorary fellow of the Royal College of Psychiatrists. I did actually have to Google her a bit to see if there's more to her than that, and I'm somewhat surprised to find that she has many other distinctions, but we shall come to all of those. She's, of course, also the first female president of the Royal College of Surgeons. A term of office 2014 to 2017 coincided almost the day with my time at the only proper Royal College, of course, of Psychiatrists, but during which time we saw a lot of each other, and I'm pleased to say still do. Claire, welcome. Now, one of the joys of this format is that we're in no rush. So we've got plenty of time, and your life and times have continued to be fascinating, but I'm always trying to find some way to kind of catch you slightly off guard with a different opening to the one you might be expecting. So it just so happened that a few days ago, I was leafing through the copies of Country Life. Not something I normally do, of course, but there I was and stumbled across a series they do called My Favourite Painting, when imagine my surprise, there you were, Dame Claire Marks. And I want to start with, we can now get that up onto the screen, the painting that you nominated for your favourite painting from, I think this was in 2016. So hopefully you'll get this right. What painting is this?
So it's a fantastic painting, isn't it? Science and Charity, and of course it's painted by Picasso. And for those people who are surprised, this was painted when he was 15 years of age. So it's extraordinary skill and observation, and just the way he observes the moment, the doctor-patient relationship, the child, the mother. And there's a lot of symbolism in this picture, which we could go on for. And I'm not an art historian, but we just
have a little bit. Do you know who the doctor actually is? Do you know who sat for the doctor?
Well, it was said that it was Picasso's father.
Yeah, I think it was. Yeah.
But of course, it was really in honor of his uncle. I think that was so. He used his father as the man. So I think it just shows that at 15, Picasso had all the skills of being an extraordinary painter, and thereafter he just changed and he started doing what he wanted rather than what other people wanted.
Which of course is something you've done an awful lot, but the other reason for starting with this painting is the sick man in the bed is a kind of is I think a Christ-like figure, and I assume meant to be. But do you know what he's suffering from?
Well, it was painted around the time of a pandemic.
Bang on, yes. Which one?
And that I don't know. So
finally got you. Yeah, it was a cholera pandemic. There was a huge cholera pandemic going on in Mallorca, in Malaga, where this was painted just before Picasso left to go to Barcelona to pursue his studies, paid for by his physician uncle. So this is a portrait of somebody who I assume will die in a pandemic, and that was a convoluted way of bringing us to our first kind of topic. Now then, you are the president of the GMC, and you have been for 2 years. By the way, what made you go for that job?
Well, I'm actually the chair of the GMC.
I'm sorry, chair. You chairs, presidents, they're all the same.
And there are lots of reasons for that. So I guess I applied for the role because I felt that even after having been president of the Royal College of Surgeons, I still had some unfinished business that I wanted to try to achieve. And part of that is around the leadership that I think the medical profession can exert on the system. And it seemed to me I'd had a little go at trying to do it for surgeons, and I wanted to try and encourage doctors to take on that role and use the role of chair of GMC to move it as a regulator into the whole arena of trying to influence how doctors behave, because we know that that directly impacts on how the sort of treatment that patients receive. And it's just an extraordinary opportunity for us to have conversations about how cultures in medicine can change for the better the experience of public patients, and of course, most importantly, at this time, for the people who actually work in the health service. And there's been...
I mean, we'll come back in a minute to this idea, can regulation actually affect culture at all, which is an interesting question. But let's start with the pandemic, okay? Because we've got into the habit of doing that because it is the thing going on around us. So how's that been affecting the GMC? I don't mean by working from home and that kind of stuff, but the things that you've been called on to deal with and referrals you've been getting, how's that been influenced by COVID?
So it's been a fascinating time. For people who aren't aware, the Emergency Powers Act came in, and with that we had the ability to create a temporary register, and that's when we went back to the people who had been either licensed or registered with us in the last 5 and then 10 years, and offered the opportunity for people to join a temporary register. On the day the emergency finishes, then that register will also finish. It's a creation of the emergency powers which the government brought in the Coronavirus Act.
So all these people who have retrained and found their mojo again back on the front line will be sent back into their hutch as soon as the act is repealed. Is that what you're saying?
Well, potentially they could do. So it's really interesting because we brought about 30,000 people back onto the register, and after people had said they didn't want to, we were left with about 24,000 people. And what's really interesting about those individuals is that the median age is only 57. So we're not talking about an army of retired doctors. We're talking about people from all ages who have, for one reason or another, relinquished their license to practice or register. But what we know is that, sadly, not many of them have actually been offered the opportunity to update their skills and join the service. And we're just about to do a survey asking people if they're still interested, because if they are, then we want to actually see if we can make it easy for them to move from the temporary register back into the permanent workforce, if that's what they're interested in doing at this time.
Now, I'm always fascinated by this. I've asked the same question of CQC leaders, etc. Is obviously in the times of a national emergency, you've cut corners a bit, I assume, to make this happen. Does it suggest that perhaps the ways in which you were doing things before the emergency were perhaps over bureaucratic or over prolonged or unnecessary?
So it's difficult to know if there were corners to cut, because of course we have only invited people back onto the register if they were people who held a license to practice and were in good standing. Mm-hmm. And if you, for instance, decided to relinquish your license and were in good standing, then you could come back at any stage in the future.
But it wouldn't be that quick or simple.
Well, I agree, but there is a risk in all of these things, but there's also a risk in not having doctors available to the service, and what we have to do is take a calculated risk and work out whether it's appropriate or not appropriate. Time will tell, but I think at the moment we feel that if there is a need to call on people who have skills, and we don't have people who are currently in the service, then it's better to have a bank of people who can be familiarised with the current working of the NHS and actually join in the COVID intent. It doesn't matter whether they're doing 111 or they're actually running something else, or if they just want to come back in a more permanent way. We always have to go back on the permanent way.
So this is kind of you in your role as almost a good cop, getting people back to work, back to get back to being doctors. What about the opposite, though, during the pandemic? Have you seen a different pattern of referrals to you for people who've been perhaps not so good?
Well, again, for people who aren't aware, we normally get about 8,500 referrals to the GMC in a year. So from members of the public, from other doctors, from hospitals. And we are running at about the same rate, but we had a paper at council about a month ago, and we have specifically had 451 referrals specifically related to COVID, and I was fascinated to see the breakdown on this. There were the 11% of people who had been complained about because they were profiteering from tests. So these miscreants that there was a 21% complaint rate about comments that people had made in the press or on social media. Interesting.
Obviously you can't talk about cases, but can you presume these have been, well, by definition, these have been in the press then, haven't they, on social media? What kind of things are you talking about?
So some of it would be doctors forgetting their need to observe complete patient confidences and patients feeling that they might or might not have been identified by posts that doctors have made. I can think of a case where a doctor had posted a video or some sort of video saying that they didn't believe in COVID. They thought it was a hoax. So there are a whole range.
I didn't realise that President Trump was under your care, but there we go. So sorry, do go on.
And then there were other complaints. I mean, there were people complaining about doctors breaking the lockdown restrictions. That's an interesting one. There are obviously a very small number of complaints concerned about safety of working environment. There were 17% of people who complained about the fact they've been put back on the temporary register. So that's a good.
Okay.
So that was 77 people, and then there were a small number of people complaining about access to care and about. Then about 25% of the complaints, about 119 complaints, were about clinical incidents and the treatment that they had received. So I think they are largely a similar sort of group of complaints to those we would normally have. It just happens at this stage that they've been related to COVID, and most of the complaints don't reach our thresholds. If you look at the normal number of complaints, 8,500, probably about 1,500 go through to some form of investigation. 350 end up in our tribunal service, and of those, probably about 100 people are either removed or suspended, and most of those are for dishonesty, for sexual misconduct, for health and alcohol and drugs reasons, and a very, very small number. I think it was last year, there were 4 people who were taken off purely because of clinical competence reasons.
So, I mean, sex, drugs and rock and roll tends to be the main reason you leave the register or you're suspended, I think. You would imagine the opportunities of that were rather less during the COVID pandemic, but perhaps not. But I think that there are some things coming through, though, that are a little different. I mean, there was a headline last week that 22 doctors are in trouble for breaches of the COVID rules, specifically the COVID rules. Now, I did jump to the conclusion that they were in trouble with you, but it turns out that's not the case. They're in trouble with their own, at the moment, with their own employer. But in the news only 2 days ago, 2 doctors from the Royal Surrey caught COVID after a social event unconnected with their work and are now under investigation by their employer. How will you react when these kind of cases start to reach you? A completely new offence, which is going to a social event and catching an illness. I don't believe that that's ever been, you would never consider disciplinary action against someone who does that before, but now that is what is happening. Have you started to think through how you will react to these new offences?
So you probably know that under the legislation as it exists, or you may not know that under the legislation as it exists, if you receive a criminal conviction, we are duty bound to investigate that. So if these cases make it as far as the criminal courts, then and they receive some sanction in the criminal court, then we would have to look at it and we would have to consider whether it affected their fitness to practice. Because what we do is we don't sanction people for sanction's sake. We look at whether they are fit to practice in the future. And that, of course, would involve the doctor presenting evidence about what they've done and also about their reflections and whether they actually were to admit that what they had done was unwise or was likely to bring themselves or the profession into disrepute. And we would have to work out what the actual
It's highly unlikely that these cases will lead to any criminal sanctions. I mean, just from the way in which the police have been acting, catching COVID after a social event, which presumably maybe the organizer might, but the people at the event, as far as I know, there's never been criminal sanctions against them. So that's highly unlikely, but they could still be referred by their employer for, if they, for example, I don't know, if they went into work afterwards or whatever. I'm just asking, have you started to think through some kind of new scenarios? I know the courts certainly have, and employment tribunals certainly have, of kind of offences that just weren't imaginable. And I don't mean criminal offences, because that's fine, you made that point, but non-criminal, things that aren't actually offences, yes, or at least have not been labelled as such.
So clearly the employer will have to think carefully about whether this is something that needs to be dealt with by the regulator, and we would have some role in discussing that with them. We on the whole, we would prefer that these issues were dealt with by the employer, rather than thrown into the mix. And unless it was really egregious, I don't think that would be something that we would be particularly interested in. But let's hypothesize, and let's say that someone tested positive, maybe took a train to Scotland to go to work in a hospital or something like
that. That could never happen. An MP would never do such a thing.
A doctor
yes,
do such a thing.
True. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But and then knowingly, took themselves into an environment. Maybe went to work on an oncology ward. I just give you. I'm giving you a. Then one might actually question whether that individual had something to answer for in terms of their insight into the risk that they pose to the safety of the public. And at the end of the day, we as a regulator are there, not least to ensure that the public is kept safe. So one could imagine these scenarios, and these are the sorts of things that we are thinking through for the future. It's not going to be easy, because every case will be different. And as I said, our main role is to look at whether people are fit to practice and whether they show the insight into what they've done and are likely to pose an ongoing threat to the safety of the public.
Okay, fair enough. And still on that topic, because it is an interesting one. I was hoping someone would have raised the questions yet, but they haven't yet. I'm sure they will very shortly, but I'm going to do it now anyway. Is the issue about anti-vaxxers and anti-vaccination. So, I mean, you of course, until recently, probably the most famous GMC case in 20 years was against the kind of the archetypal anti-vaxxer Andy Wakefield. But what about now? How are you going to feel if we find doctors are actively advising their patients against taking when the corona vaccine becomes available, or indeed pushing other discredited or dangerous theories? Where are you on that? And what's the boundary between where you would take action as opposed to this being a genuine view, honestly held, and an issue of free speech?
Yes. So, I mean, of course, Andrew Wakefield, he was, his in part was the research fraud.
Yes.
But in terms of high level principles, we absolutely expect doctors to act with honesty and integrity, and in order to justify the trust in the profession. And in a way, the spread of misinformation is incompatible with that obligation. So that would be our high level rule from which we would start to look at issues like that. And to a certain extent, it will depend on the amount of scientific evidence and the weight of evidence. So, if you had a doctor, for instance, saying, I don't think that a vaccine from one manufacturer works and another one does, and you were to find out that they had shares in one manufacturer or another, we would have two things to say to them. The first is, where is your evidence, and so on. The second is, have you declared a sufficient conflict?
But that's an easy one, Claire, isn't it? That's easy. But we know that most people who have who are against vaccinations do so honestly. Some don't, I agree, but the vast majority honestly hold the view that vaccines are dangerous, and some of them are doctors, but they're not dishonest. It would be unfair to call them dishonest.
But the doctor has a duty not to allow their own beliefs to interfere with them giving honest information to the patient with which the patient can make up their mind. So if a doctor is an anti-vaxxer, then they still have to present the patient with the scientific evidence and an honest assessment of what the current evidence and the current acceptance in public is. And we don't have a vaccine yet, but in the event that there is an effective vaccine, then we expect doctors to be able to have that conversation in a rational and scientific way with their patients, so that they can allow the patient to decide for themselves.
What do you think? Do you think there will be any impact on you? I know it has been discussed in certain circles in government, no decision taken, and actually this is on compulsory vaccination. And this was before COVID. It's literally before COVID, not after, but it's still there and being talked about. Do you think that if vaccination did become compulsory in this country, that would change the way you would approach these issues?
Clearly, we are governed by the rule of law. So there is a law of the land that says you must. Then we obviously have to take that into account in our determinations. I mean, I think it's unlikely that that's get to that point.
I think that's true, but we are, I think, almost in a minority. There are 13 EU nations that have elements of compulsory vaccination. So I wouldn't say it's impossible.
Not impossible, but I would much prefer a society in which we enabled people to make rational judgments, and that people trusted their doctors to represent the true science and the beliefs. I think.
Okay.
I think.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. Actually, I don't think we should do it, but it still may happen. Okay, so still with the GMC though. Now, interesting enough, I was about to kind of lead off and say that a letter from the GMC is rarely greeted with hoots of delight by any practicing doctor. And your colleague, David Jones, RCS Council Manager, says almost the same thing. He said, what are you going to do about the feeling of fear that greets any letter from the GMC, whatever it is about, when it drops on the doormat?
Well, I was just about to disagree with you, because I've just had a very nice communication with someone who had a letter from me congratulating them on the end of their training program. I think there are some nice letters that come from the GMC. And of course, the other one that used to drop through was your annual retention fee as well. So
true. But okay, come on then. And by the way, I should also say Dr. Balu is agreeing with you, actually talks about the fact they've been pleasantly surprised by your letters that they've been receiving from you. I presume you signed them all personally, about well-being. But let's get back to what David Jones is writing. It's still the case, isn't it, that a letter from the GMC can induce a feeling of almost, it's probably the most frightening experience in a medical career. I mean, when we ask medical students what they find frightening, they always say, well, when a patient dies, and then we finally show them the data that actually a referral to the GMC is easily the most traumatic event in many doctors' careers.
Yes, and unfortunately, it's not that common. I think that it's like a ticket for a speeding fine. It's always unwelcome, but for those people who have stuck to the rules, I think you should know that the vast majority of these letters do not go anywhere else. I mean, we have tried very hard to look at the language we use. We've tried very hard to be sure to refer people to the help they can get when they get such a letter. And I must actually fly a flag for your wife, Dame Claire Gerardo's service, the practitioners' health service practice, who have done fantastic work with doctors who have been in our processes. And we've learned a lot from some of the work that they've done and adjusted accordingly. So thank you, Claire. Shout out for your service. But I think it's inevitable that these things are unwelcome. And there's a sense of outrage. You know, I've been practicing for 43 years and, you know, I've got a million one letters of thank you letters. And, you know, just because I did X or Y, or I wasn't very polite or whatever it was, I've had this letter. I have to say there are a lot of things that come to us that we don't even write to doctors about. So if you, of those 8,500 referrals that we get, we don't even contact a number of doctors over those, because we dismiss them straight away. You can't believe, you know, we have things like, this doctor cut their Lalandier hedge too low, and so I'm writing to complain, or this doctor parked in my parking space or outside my drive. So there are things like that for which we don't even start to waste the postage. But there are things that we have to investigate. We are duty bound to investigate. And what we are trying to do is to ensure that when we do send letters, the language we use is easily understandable, that people understand where they can go for help, and that we are able to help the individuals themselves. So we have a helpline. We can direct people to advice services. We can often help doctors who don't have a defence union by referring them to law students who now provide help to help people prepare submissions to our tribunal services. So all I can do is to say we are on the case, but at the end of the day, we recognise that no one will love their regulator when they get a letter that says they've been complained about.
I think that's a fair point. And we should also, a quick shout out for my colleague Lewis Appleby, who I think has helped also in changing some of the language that you use in talking to doctors. But I think people will say it's not like a speeding fine, is it? If I get a speeding fine, I don't have to tell my employer. I can still run for public office. I can still run to be president of a college. Whereas if I have a letter from the GMC, even before that I've been, any finding has been made, I have to tell my employer, and I can't run in most colleges for officers. So it's not quite the same as a speeding fine.
No, except that, but we expect people to be open and honest, and part of that is telling your employer or the body that you work for, and part of it is actually accepting that however this may will end up, you need to commit very substantial time and energy to making sure it is dealt with appropriately. And I think that many of the doctors who really get into trouble do so because they don't respond to our letters. They don't actually answer in a timely fashion. If we say we want to hear your evidence within 3 weeks, then please send it within 3 weeks. Or indeed let us know why you can't or how you're going to do it. We do hope that when we ask people to appear in front of tribunals, which, as I've just said, is not very often, people actually will turn up, because the chances of doing well at a tribunal if you don't turn up are pretty small. And so there are some ground rules that we can talk to people about. We hope that by doing that, we will make the whole experience, although it's never going to be nice, as easy as possible.
Okay, I think that those are very fair points, obviously. Now, another thing that's I'm sure you anticipated would come up sooner or later. I mentioned Andy Wakefield is probably the most famous case of the GMC, but well up there is another case of Dr. Bawa-Garba, which did, I think, cause a great deal of turmoil and distress. I mean, not least to the family concerned, but also to the profession and to the GMC. I mean, you were not in charge there, of course, but you inherited some of the fallout from that. And the first thing I would say is looking back on that case, do you actually have any organizational regrets about the way that played out?
So it's really interesting, because my first work for the GMC, of course, was to start chairing.
Yes, of course. Yes, I've forgotten that.
Inquiry into gross negligence manslaughter. So it's a really sad case of the child Jack Adcock, who died, and Dr. Bawa-Garba, who of course was convicted in a criminal court of gross negligence manslaughter, and that conviction was what brought her to the attention of the General Medical Council. So my original interest in this case was the thought that that genuine mistakes might end up in the criminal court, and sadly, I wasn't able to complete the inquiry because of my appointment to this role. And Leslie Hamilton did a fantastic job with the review team looking at it and produced a report which, for those people who haven't looked at it, is well worth looking at, because there are learnings for every section, and not least for the GMC. But in fact, by the time I arrived at the GMC, I think as an organisation, they had a real soul search, and they'd learnt a lot, and they still continue to talk about the learning from that, and not least this recognition that in many of our processes, the GMC is deemed to be differentially behaving against people from Black and Asian and minority ethnic origins. And so that's a focus which I've very much taken up and run with, because I do think that although we don't go out looking for cases, the way those cases, and indeed the case of Dr. Bawa-Garba, are investigated in the trusts, by their employers, is very much up there in the reasons that people are referred to the General Medical Council. And I think we can make an impact by talking about what we have seen, by showing the data of what we have, and by actually interfacing with the service and saying, look at what's coming to us, understand what is happening, understand the reasons why perhaps people from these ethnicities are not getting the same experience as white people, or people coming from as international medical graduates are not getting the same experience as home medical graduates. But there are some really important intrinsic disparities that we see in the data, in the data from the National Training Survey, about bullying, harassment, about some of the perceptions from some of the Black and ethnic minority groups. So there are huge disparities in the way people feel that they're being treated in the service, not only by us. And I think we can actually be in there with the conversation, with the service, trying to get people to understand how the leadership has a responsibility to actually address some of the issues that have long been known about within the health service. We've got some real issues as a regulator, and some of our processes are almost designed to make it more difficult for people coming from international medical graduate origins. And one of the reasons we're so keen to have some regulatory change, which may be coming up next year, is so that we can try and iron out some of the problems in those regulatory processes. But yes, there's a lot for us to learn in service.
Catherine Royce just reminded us about the case of Mr. Selu, another medical manslaughter case. But rather than discuss that, I can have a look at the interview that David Selu gave with Roger Kirby in this series a few weeks ago, which is really fascinating and moving to listen to. Now, there's lots more GMC questions coming in, but also questions people want to talk a bit more about you, which is fair enough. And so let's change the subject a bit at this moment and go back to you. Now, one of the things we have in common is we both have quite English-sounding names, Marks and Wesley, but actually the way that they're written, they're not English at all. So we also have a similar background. So tell me a bit about your family background.
So my mother was a good Cumbrian teacher, and she joined the Wrens during the war. And as a result of that, on a train, met my father, who was in the Pioneer Corps in the war, in the army. And the reason he was in the Pioneer Corps was because he couldn't have been in the General Army, because he was a German Jewish emigre who came to this country, having left Germany in 1933, when his family basically had to flee Germany because of their Jewish and background, and also because of my grandfather's role in Germany at that time. And being a German alien at the outbreak of the war, in fact, my father was interned for a short period of time before they realized that he was no threat to this country. But they like many other German Jewish immigrants, he joined the Pioneer Corps. Anyway, that's when my parents met, and that's. And
your grandfather was he was a very eminent, I think, lawyer or legislator.
Yeah, he was what's called a Landgerichtspräsident, and they lived in Heidelberg and he worked in Mannheim. And of course, the reason that they managed to escape was that he just didn't happen to be in the office in Mannheim the day the Nazis came for him, and the people in his office were brave enough to warn him off. And they didn't stay at home that night, and they drove by back roads to the border and got into Switzerland. My grandmother, my grandfather's wife was Swiss, and so they got into Switzerland, but of course the Swiss wouldn't keep.
No.
Wouldn't have anything to do with them.
No, they had a pretty strict immigration policy, as they still do. Okay, so that's a family background. Has that had much of an impact on you, do you think? I mean, you don't talk about it very much, but I get the impression it's there.
So my father, now 98 and a half, lives with me, and I think I've learned a lot about the way to survive from him. And he is somebody who, despite perhaps his lack of parenting and the disruption in his life, has always looked forward and been able to move on from the past. He's always been a person to accept the good things in life, recognize when you're having it good, to love the people around you. He's a man of immense learning and a very, very intellectually sound person. So I've learned a lot about that and seen the benefit of growing old gracefully. And as my hair greys and I grow older, I shall try and work harder at it, Simon.
I was about to say that your father must have therefore been very disappointed when he became a surgeon, but I wouldn't say that. That would be a very cheap remark. But tell me then, come on, let's do that. So you at UCL, you qualify as a doctor, and I mean, just statistically, it was an unusual career choice that you made.
It was an unusual career choice, but like so many people, I think I was very much influenced by the person that I first did work experience with, and he was a very charismatic local surgeon who was not only charismatic, but a wonderful teacher. And I eventually went and did a house job for him. And I can remember saying, I think I would like to be a surgeon. And he basically said, sure, why not? You know, you do realize that you will have to make sure so you have all your ducks in a row. And I mean, this was a really good lesson, because he didn't say to me, this will be easy. He didn't say it's easy for anybody. But what he said is, if you make sure you have all your ducks in a row, you've got all the boxes ticked, then it's going to be easier for you than if you actually do what a lot of people do, which is just wing it and assume that at some stage, if they try often enough, they'll be successful. So there are some really good life lessons to be learnt from people who are honest with you. You may not like what they're saying, but they're honest. And then when it came to actually choosing what branch of surgery, I think that was much more difficult, because I loved everything I did. I did some thoracics, I did some vascular surgery, I did general gut surgery, urology. I had a great time doing all of those things. But in the moment of having to make the decision, I think orthopedics found me. And there was also a sort of a negative push. I had this extraordinary moment when I was sent for by the then professor of surgery at UCH, who was a functioning alcoholic. I mean, and a pathological person. Let's not speak ill of the dead, but he was. And I made the mistake of booking my careers interview just after lunch. Bad time, because he'd been in the pub over lunchtime. And he sort of slumped in the door and looked at me. I don't think he actually understood why I was there. And he just sort of said, and I'm not going to pretend to do the accent, but he was a Scot. He just said, you know, why the hell do you want to do surgery? And I said, oh, no, Professor, I think it's a great career. And he said, well, what branch of surgery? And I said, well, and I was doing orthopedics at the time. I said, I think I'm going to do orthopedics. And his answer was, you don't want to trust those fuckers. And that was the end of the careers interview. He just slumped back in the sort of bed.
He wasn't that drunk then, was he?
And I left and went down to my clinic, where I was asked what had happened, and I recounted it verbatim, and the rest is history. I was an orthopedic surgeon. So
it's interesting. Avril Mansfield was on Desert Island Discs. I'm sure you must have listened to it. She was obviously very, very good. But I thought she made quite. I think she made quite light of maybe she was just simply remembering the truth. But she made it sound like it was all very easy and straightforward. She had a couple of funny stories about patients, but didn't really ever say anything about colleagues or anything like that. And I don't know, I just got the impression that it couldn't have been that straightforward for either you or her.
No, it's not straightforward. And I think if I reflect on my time, I could recount a whole range of not very nice occurrences, but it's probably, for those people who've had children, it's probably like childbirth. You forget the pain of the birth for the joy of the sort of success. But strangely enough, I've thought about it more in recent years, and I think I've never experienced such undermining and bullying as perhaps I did when I was president of the Royal College of Surgeons. It is alive and well, and according to our National Trainee Service, particularly alive and well in surgery. So I think people's behaviours almost don't surprise me anymore. It's what surprises me is that they should think they can get away with it. And I can remember a wonderful moment when a colleague at the College of Surgeons, I was proposing a program by which we rebuilt part of the college, and one of the colleagues came in and said, "Now, Claire, you can't possibly rebuild when you do realise, do you, that the Royal College of Surgeons is an old boys' club?" Well, what am I supposed to respond to that? Kind of, oh, really? Really? Is this true? No, not at all.
I do remember when one of your colleagues as well came up to me at Royal College dinner and said the problem with Claire Marks is that she's a feminist. So I do remember, I think I told you that at the time.
Yes, and I probably said if thinking that everybody should have a chance to achieve their full potential means I'm a feminist, then I'm a feminist.
You did say that, yes. Okay, well, I mean, you were not only, you were, before you got that, you were the first female president, it is president, isn't it, of the British Association of Orthopaedics. And then, of course, you became the first female president of the Royal College of Surgeons. Now, it's an interesting thing that, I mean, it's not clear when the Royal College of Surgeons was founded, 1368, some say 1493. The general view seems to be 1540. So let's give you the benefit of the doubt and assume that your 400 college is 460 years old. Will it, or 480 years old? So my question is this: will it be another 480 years before they appoint the next female president?
Are you asking me whether they've had two female presidents, the first and the last? I mean, I don't know. I would be so sad if I thought that I'd made so little impact that people shouldn't see the benefit of a diverse leadership chain. And in the same way as following Lord Ribeiro, when we had our first colour, it would be very sad if that it was another however many years before we had another person of colour as a president. I think that the college does have a question to ask itself, which is if they truly believe in the need for diversity in the leadership, then they have to work harder to ensure that that happens. And it's no good just saying, oh yes, we must have more women. Let's do that. They have to work out why women don't want to join that club, or if they do join that club, why it is that the people in the club don't want to see them in those leadership roles. We have 56% of our medical graduates are women, and we see already by the time it gets to the core training years that we're not taking as many people into surgery. And in orthopedics and in general surgery, in orthopedics, we've still only got 18% of consultants who are women, even though we've had people, nearly 50% of women graduates for 15, 20 years. I mean, it cannot be that they don't want to do these jobs. I'm sure they do. If you look at other branches of surgery which have different processes, they are able to attract more people. And it's something about the way we expect people to train, the way we treat them, the way we bring them on. And I challenged the people in the colleges plural, when I was president, to actually go out and find people from diverse backgrounds and bring them in and make sure that they did prosper and grow, and they were able to be in a place to have all the boxes ticked, so they would be in a place to be able to become leaders of the future. So that's what we've got to do. We've got to grow our leadership in a much better way than we do at the moment.
And you've asked Helena Kennedy to look at diversity in the college, I believe.
Well, the current president, Neil Moulton.
I'm sorry, yes, do that, yeah. What kind of things do you think she may, you obviously can't know, but if it was you, what further things would you highlight, do you think?
I think there's quite a lot of evidence that enabling people to do some of their training flexibly will make a difference. Having the ability for people who are trained and want to do leadership roles to do them in a more family-friendly way. So if you insist on examiners doing 3 days over a weekend, and that is the only time that they have to be with their families, both men and women are going to find that difficult. So there are all sorts of different ways of doing it. But I think most importantly, we have to be prepared to put the same effort into growing people who aren't in the same mold as we are, therefore people of greater diversity, to grow them to be part of that leadership.
But yeah, I don't think that could possibly be disagreed with. One issue that is now, I've been slightly unfair about surgeons. You know that I'm that all the time. But one thing we have to be absolutely fair about, it does take an awful lot of hours to produce a surgeon. I mean, when you were training, you were doing 1 in 2s, 1 in 1 when a colleague was off on leave. And there just are a huge number of hours that just have to be put in. And I've heard plenty of your colleagues, including you, say that over the years, that those hours have dropped, and maybe people now are qualifying as surgeons, becoming consultants, who just don't have that experience that they would have had a generation ago. And that's one of the reasons why you get more referrals now in the first consultant year to you at the GMC. So how do you square that just simple need to get the experience, which is much greater, I think, than as a craft speciality that you are, with also making it more family friendly and all the things that we would like it to be?
So I look back on my career, and even though I spent a lot of time as a registrar and then as a senior registrar, I think I was a much better surgeon after I'd been a consultant for 10 years than I was when I first became a consultant. And the truth is, practice makes perfect. So what we need to be thinking about is how we mentor and coach people in those early years such that they are able to function as fully fledged consultants, but they feel that they are in a position to ask for help and to learn and continuing their lifelong learning in a very meaningful way. There are plenty of skills that you can learn just in terms of sewing up and so on. You can practice those basic things, but what comes with time is the experience. And of course, the real experience is learning when not to operate rather than when to operate. And you can learn some of that through discussions with your colleagues, and of course, more use of the multidisciplinary teams, although that has to be a functional thing. But you mentioned the referrals that come to us. Many of the referrals that come are about behaviours and attitudes. They're not so much about the clinical issues. And so what we need to be thinking about is, how do we enable people to function in their roles and take on board the lessons that are learned from being part of an inclusive department where they are mentored and coached, and they accept that mentoring and coaching.
Okay. And are you still mentoring people?
I am, and I feel very privileged to do that when people come.
I think the privilege is probably theirs. And then one last question about the future of surgery. Your current president was saying a couple of days ago, talking about the tsunami you can't really have a tsunami of operations that weren't done, can you? That doesn't make any sense. But anyway, that is what he said. There's a tsunami of undone operations coming towards us because of COVID. And he mentioned a survey in which of your membership, of which people said they were only operating at 50% as a level that they had been this time last year. How do you feel about that? What is the future of surgery in a time of COVID? How are we going to avoid this tsunami, or negative tsunami?
So I think one of the things that has been really heartwarming is the extraordinary ability of doctors to lead change, and those people who take on change and have enabled new practice and new ways of working has been a real credit to the profession. So embracing the change that has been forced upon them during COVID has been one thing. Whether one can maintain some of those changes, and some of those changes have meant that people have worked in different environments, in different places, hot and cold splits, different ways of working. All of these things are up for grabs in the future. I am optimistic that if the profession seizes the moment to take back some of these leadership roles, they will be able to guide the service to some sensible conclusions about how they can not get back in the short term to business as normal, because I think we know in the short term that's just not going to happen, but how they can actually progress the service for the future. And some of those changes may be permanent, and they may be for the benefit of patients. All too often in the past, the people resisted change because they just found it all too difficult. And I think one of the ways that all of us who are living through this pandemic cope and manage well is that actually we take on board change and actually recognize that sometimes, although it's uncomfortable, it can produce something better. So I think it's a really big problem, and I think the stress on a surgeon who knows they've got surgery to do, if can feel the pain of their patients and feel the anxiety of their patients as they wait for it, is phenomenal. And I commend my colleagues who are dealing with this every day, and indeed the teams. And I think about the receptionists in hospital and all these other people who hear terrible stories from patients who have been cancelled at the last moment and turned back. And that has created an additional stress and strain. But I would encourage people to use this time to actually think about how they can come up with some of the solutions, because for sure, no one's got all the answers. And so this is a moment when people with solutions will have a chance to be listened to. And I would say, seize the moment, get in there.
Carpe diem. So in your favorite picture, what do you think the modern doctor. Do you think the modern doctor in the future will still be there holding a hand? Do you think that we'll ever hold patients' hands again as they did when Picasso painted his father?
Patients still have their hand held. There may be a bit of PPE in between them, but I think touch is such an important part of the doctor-patient relationship.
Yeah.
So much, as not only the doctor-patient relationship, our relationships as a society, and that is probably going to be the seat of so much misery and discomfort over these winter months. I mean, we can all sort of put virtual arms around people and virtually hug people, but it's not the same. And I can see that I'm just so lucky, you know, that I've got a husband who I can actually will look after me. So I think we need to go the extra mile to make our patients feel that we're still interested in them, to make our friends feel that we're still interested in them and that we want to look after them and we want to talk to them. And it's never been a better time to have conversations and a more important time.
I couldn't agree with you more. And of course, it has been a pleasure having this virtual conversation with you, but I still look forward to more real conversations as well. Now, don't go away. By the way, I said at the top that your highest honour is to be a fellow of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, but of course I forgot, almost as eminent, is that you're a fellow of the Royal Society of Medicine as well, even though we haven't yet been able to give you that honour, but we will be, we hope, COVID permitting in July. But that does allow me to segue into our usual plea for support for an institution that clearly knows what it's doing and giving you an honour, but also in setting up and running this particular series. And if you have enjoyed it, or even if you haven't, remember it all comes from us at the RSM, and it's free, unlike the costs of keeping the RSM show on the road, which is anything but free. So if you are, as Richard III says, in the giving vein today, please do feel free to donate. And equally free to come up to the RSM. We are open for a drink or a meal. I'm going to be there on Monday with Roger Kirby, our new president, and he has promised anyone who turns up in the bar that night, he will stand them a free drink. But whether you're Scrooge or Shakespeare, come back next Wednesday, because that's our middle of the day COVID seminar. This time it's on ITU and the second wave. We are up to date as ever with Gary Masterson and Alison Pittard, who's been with us before. They are both fantastic speakers. And then on Thursday, I'll be breaking new ground by interviewing not just one, but two people, the Alistair Campbell and his partner, Fiona Miller, together on a couch. They're allowed to because they are a couple, live from the RSM, 7 p.m. next Thursday. So now back to you, Claire. Now, Dr. Jagdish has made a comment, and what he just said is something I just want to end with. He says, my daughter, recently qualified, received a letter from Dame Claire personally that moved me greatly, showing as it did such empathy, understanding, and compassion. As a man, I do not believe that a male chair of the GMC could ever have penned this. So there you are, Claire. You do write many of your own letters, I know you do, and you are doing a great job. Having done a great job at the Surgeons, you are doing a great job at the GMC, and it is definitely, and my wife just waved at me and put a thumbs up saying it is a changing organization. You have led it into better pastures, although judging from some of the comments, it's still not plain sailing, by the way, you know that. But thank you so much for coming. And as ever, it's just great to talk to you. I think it's cheered many of us up.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And good night, everybody. See you next week.